I think that they're going to find Trump an uncomfortable presence in world affairs, and that's why I think the BRICS will probably become more important as a way
I
of
would
kind of
say
pushing
more
back.
unpredictable than uncomfortable, but they are happy with the chaos is the real
Oh
issue.
yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. No, no. Look. You can be sure. You can be absolutely sure that Putin was cheering.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 178 for the 20th of February 2025. I want to talk about a couple of fellows that I'm really not so sure of. It's hard to overstate just how disappointing the last century has been for Argentina. I think it was David McWilliams who said on his podcast that if you were emigrating from Ireland 100 years ago and your choice was to go around the world to Australia or north to Canada or south to Argentina, based on economic potential, Argentina would have been the obvious choice. Of the three, Argentina came first in population, in GDP and in per capita income. Argentina had a much better climate, huge natural resources, and a seemingly never-ending market in Europe for its seemingly never-ending supply of beef produced by its vast area of grasslands. Once refrigerated shipping had become a possibility. Not many Irish people took that route, perhaps because of language differences, but there can be no doubt that those who did bet on the wrong horse. Or maybe cow. The Wikipedia article on the economic history of Argentina says, by 1913, Argentina was among the world's 10 wealthiest states per capita. Beginning in the 1930s, the Argentine economy deteriorated notably. I think that's putting it kindly. Argentina is now ranked at number 72 globally for GDP per capita. Canada is in the 14th slot and Australia is at number 11. Argentina holds the world record for the number of IMF interventions, 21 since they joined the International Monetary Fund in 1952. No kidding. We're still smarting over our disgrace 15 years later, quite rightly, but for 2 generations, Argentina has had an average of 1 IMF intervention every 3.5 years. In fact, of the 94 countries in hoc to the IMF, Argentina accounts for almost a third of the total debt. But most countries on that IMF list were always poor, at least in modernity. The real kick in the teeth for the long-suffering Argentinians is that they used to be rich. It's a bitter irony that its name is literally about how rich it was. I could go into great detail about the reasons for Argentina's decline. I've spoken recently about how close the correlation is between democracy and wealth, as well as every other positive index, but I don't have the space for that here. I'll just quote Wikipedia again. The single most important factor in Argentina's decline has been political instability since 1930, when a military junta took over, ending 7 decades of civilian constitutional government. Then came one of the fellas that I'm not so sure about. On the 10th of December 2023, Javier Milei was elected president of Argentina. It's important to note that his party, La Libertad Avanza, was not a large political force. Even now, they only hold 16% of the seats in parliament. The party is variously described as far-right, ultra-conservative or libertarian, and it's hard to tell, but I think that doesn't describe Milei adequately. In case you haven't heard about him, his style is unique, to say the least. And I'm not just talking about his hair. He must have been an Eminem fan in the noughties. He campaigned holding a chainsaw that he revved up in front of crowds to symbolise what he intended to do to public spending. All this I can source online, but after that it gets difficult. Things are so chaotic in Argentina that it's easy to manipulate start and end dates to make figures about anything sound either very good or very bad. So many people are determined to paint him in either a good or bad light that it's hard to work out the truth, and trying to research Milei's job performance feels like...
Oh. Am I long? Yeah! They didn't serve pints. Oh. Only buckets. Yeah! There was only one barmaid. Oh. For every man. Yeah!
Argentina's inflation rate, as reported by Reuters, is now at about 3%. 3% per month, which works out at about 45% per year. But that's down from a rate of over 1,500%. But that rate was when Milei was first in office. But in the years before he took office, the rate was between 100 and 200%, so getting it under 50% is still an achievement. Or maybe it's not, because Milei cut public spending by 31%, taking a massive amount of money out of the economy, which of course flattens the inflation rate because nobody has any money to buy anything. There's a story in Reason magazine, and I want to preface this by saying that it's not really a neutral source. It's very much a libertarian publication, and they really are fanboys for the sort of economics that Milei promotes. But to be fair, their reporting is usually factual. The Media Bias Fact Check website rates them as ideological but highly credible. Reason magazine's story says that Milei swept away rent controls on private residences, along with most other non-financial regulations on residential letting. This caused some rents to shoot up, not surprisingly. But Reason reports it also caused a huge influx of new supply into the market, which they say has caused real rents, that's to say adjusted for the very substantial inflation, it caused real rents to go down. This, they say, is evidence of the free market working. The previous laws had been keeping a lot of supply out of the market because rent controls were set in pesos, rent could only be adjusted at set times and in line with the official inflation rate, which didn't reflect a currency and an economy in freefall. Again, I want to put a big health warning beside this story. It seems that they're using data from just one listings website to judge both the supply and rental prices. But I think that with hundreds of thousands of vacant properties in the midst of a housing crisis, we don't have to look too far to realise that regulation can have a big negative impact on supply. So who's the other fella? He's Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador. Like Milei, he also comes from a minor party, and even more than Milei, his radical policies have made him wildly more popular than his party. El Salvador has its share of economic problems, but its real issue is crime. And whatever you think of them, there is no ambiguity about the success of his policies, and the voters certainly agree. Bukele won with 53% of the vote in 2019, and he was re-elected a year ago with 85% of the vote. He got 13 times more votes than his nearest rival. With about the same population as Ireland, El Salvador had 6,656 murders in 2015. El Salvador had 200 times more murders than Ireland. You heard that right, 200 times more. Ireland has about one murder every 10 days. El Salvador had 20 murders every day, the large majority of them associated with the country's huge and powerful criminal gangs, notably the notorious MS-13. Bukele basically sent the military to defeat the gangs and has rounded them up into newly built maximum security prisons. In March 2022, Bukele started the Régimen d'Exception, basically emergency powers which suspended many constitutional rights along with making a series of criminal reforms which made conviction and imprisonment easier and harsher. It was supposed to last for 30 days, but it is still in force and it's been extended 28 times. On its own terms, it's working. The murder rate is down 98%. It seems to have brought El Salvador from being one of the most dangerous countries in the world to being close to par with many Western countries. But even without talking about the human rights issues here, it might not be all that good. The murder rate peaked in 2015, 7 years before Bukele's Régimen d'Exception, when gangs essentially negotiated a non-aggression pact between themselves, followed by a more comprehensive peace pact in 2019. And the figures don't include killings by police, which have shot up. There have been about 150 since the start of the Régimen d'Exception. Plus, maybe 100 murders in prisons, where so many gang members now are. It's hard to tell, but gang members may also have started a policy of hiding the bodies of victims to avoid police attention, where before they would often display victims' bodies prominently to create fear in the population. But here's the thing. Taking all that into account, you could say that Bukele has cut the murder rate not by 98%, but only by 90%. And if you question either his methods or achievements, or those of Milei in Argentina, you have to do that in the context of the situation. You may say that Milei, in his efforts to reform the economy, could end up burning the house down. The problem is that he simply can't do that because the Argentinian economy was already a burnt-out, smoking wreck when he arrived. And the human rights violations in El Salvador are real and serious, but Salvadorians were not choosing between rights violations and no rights violations. They were choosing which rights violations. And even the post-gang truce murder levels, 120 murders or so per month, that was horrendous anyway. And of course, that's only the tip of the iceberg of the vast criminality that Salvadorians had to endure every day. Of course, the reason these two outsiders were elected was because of the horrendous state of their countries. So what's to learn? 1, criticize them for sure. But 2, do that in the context of the situation they were trying to handle. And 3, most of all, thank the stars that we have the luxury of not having to choose which of our rights will be violated. In a moment, we'll have the interview. But first, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially EF, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. It's not nearly in the same league as some other big Irish podcasters that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen to the podcast and appreciate it. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as EF and other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
I'm joined now by Daniel Mulhall. Daniel is the author of Pilgrim Souls, W.B. Yeats and the Ireland of His Time, that was published a couple of years back by New Island Books, but that only scratches at the surface of his illustrious career. He is currently a consultant with DLA Piper, a law firm, and also with Rockwood Public Affairs. But prior to that, in 2001, he was made ambassador of Ireland to Malaysia. In 2009, he became ambassador to Germany. In 2013, he became ambassador to the UK. And in 2017, he got the daddy of them all, the biggest gig in the Department of Foreign Affairs, the ambassador to the United States. And since then, he has also been a distinguished professor at New York University. Daniel, that's a hell of a CV. And you've obviously, you're having an incredible career. And that goes back, I guess, over quite a few years. And you've got a lot of experience with that. And the question I really have to ask you, is the world going nuts?
Yes and no. The world is always a bit nutty, in my experience. I don't recall in the 40 years plus I was involved with the Department of Foreign Affairs and doing various jobs within the department. I don't recall any time when there was a perfect peace or a perfect tranquility in the world. So there's always a lot of upheaval. And of course, we're always inclined to think that our time is the most significant, the most turbulent, or whatever.
Yeah, that's my question.
Of all.
Is it?
Yeah, but, well, I mean, look, I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have resulted in the end of civilization as we know it, right? I am old enough to remember the Cold War, when at any time there could have been a misjudgment, a miscalculation, a mistake, which could have led to a global war with huge and massive destruction of a kind that you can hardly even contemplate because it's so awful. So that kind of nuclear standoff is still there, of course, because there still are three major countries that are heavily armed with nuclear weapons.
A few minor ones as well.
Yeah, the United States, Russia, and China. They're the ones who could conduct, I suppose, the kind of war that would be a danger to civilization as we know it. So yes, but my take on this is that history has periods of relative stability and periods of change and turbulence, and then there's usually the pendulum normally swings back to some degree of stability again. And I suppose the question is whether we are now in one of those transition periods where you have all sorts of risky, threatening possibilities, which may or may not come about. If you look through history, you had the Napoleonic Wars, which were obviously very destructive in the early 19th century. Then you had a period of, relative peace, say, until the Crimean War,
basically.
And the Franco-Prussian War of the 1860s changed things again in Europe. And then you had another period of great prosperity and economic expansion in what was called the Gilded Age in America and so forth. And then you had a total breakdown of international order between 1914 and 1945. And then in the period after the Second World War, we again had a period of stability, albeit stability that could have gone badly wrong had the Cold War become a hot war. But you had a period of stability, and I suppose most of us, or many people, thought that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was a kind of an end of history moment. I don't mean literally.
Fukushima
But
quote.
yeah, Fukushima. But I think what he really meant was that it appeared that a certain type of social and political model had kind of triumphed, and that we might be in an era where you no longer would have this kind of ideological conflicts that had been so troublesome during the Cold War, and even going back further to the era of the authoritarian regimes of the 1920s and 30s. But that didn't quite work out the way I think we had hoped for, and we had this. You had 9/11 and all that followed on from 9/11, and I suppose we're still in that in the backwash of that kind of breakdown of the sort of post-Cold War apparent equilibrium in the world. And today we have a situation where the United States is going through an interesting period in its history. Europe is having similar encounters with a different type of politics, which is obviously growing in strength in Germany, France, the UK.
You're talking about far-right parties.
I'm talking about these populist parties, whatever you call them. They're populist parties that are different from the parties that have presided over European governments for the last 70 years, since the end of the 80 years since the end of the Second World War. So yeah, I mean, so the question is this a moment when all bets are off and everything can go haywire and everything can go in all sorts of directions? We don't know, and it's impossible to say. We won't, unfortunately, we won't know
And if
until probably
we don't,
some of us are no longer around.
if you don't know, Daniel, what hope do the rest of us have? Let me put a more precise question than that, though,
Yeah,
because and clearly you were in. I'm not going to make the Ferrero Rocher jokes, but you were clearly in the diplomatic service for a
I
long
was
time,
40 years. Yeah.
and it strikes me that the way that is run internationally, not just for Ireland, is that there is something along the lines of a gentleman's agreement, an expectation that everybody plays within a certain area, and there are some activities that are illegal, like spying or whatever, but that are kind of expected, but that there's another category of behaviour that is beyond the pale. And this sort of, I think, is reflected in, you could see perhaps in Britain, this sort of good chaps concept that they never really felt that they needed to have a constitution because these sort of well-educated fellows from Eton and Oxford and so forth knew what was the right sort of thing to do, and they weren't wrong uns, and they would do it. And Boris Johnson really sort of broke that down, perhaps with the assistance of some people advising him. And it certainly seems that Donald Trump is somebody who is not content to play within that type of predefined area. Have we been naive since, let's say, World War II? Expecting that sort of level of basic agreement about things that are beyond the pale would not be infringed on? Or are we likely to see a return to expected behaviour?
Well, I think in America, they call this process guardrails. They talk about the guardrails that have traditionally operated to sort of keep things on track in America over the last, couple of hundred years. Yes, it is true that Donald Trump has been able to at least look aside from those guardrails and not be hemmed in by them. Now,
We
whether
have, for example, JD Vance. They're saying very, very clearly that they don't accept what are essentially very long-standing Supreme Court interpretations of the Constitution.
right, so there you have the seeds of what is going to be an epic internal struggle in the United States, because I mean, it's one thing to talk, as has been done by various people in the last few weeks, about, well, you know, do we really have to allow judges to overturn the will of the people and to decide that President Trump, who's been duly elected, democratically elected, can't do certain things? Well, let's see. I mean, it would be a huge leap in the dark if a US president were to defy the Supreme Court. Basically, would be to say, we don't accept any interpretation of the Constitution other than the one that I myself have. Okay, that would be a huge step, and of course, it's possible. I mean, there is a historical precedent. I remember reading about this in my study of American history. Andrew Jackson, who was a president, in some ways not hugely unlike Donald Trump, and that he was an outsider. He hadn't, but he had been a general, so he had more maybe experience in public affairs than Donald Trump had. But on one occasion, he's supposed to have said, he may not have said it, but he's supposed to have said, "Well, the Supreme Court can make a judgment, but let them enforce it."
Yep.
So that was a kind of a challenge to the authority of the Supreme Court. I still think that it would be a huge move for any American president, even one as powerful and as determined as Donald Trump, and surrounded by people who are also determined to change things in a radical way. It would be a huge move and a risky move for any US president to simply say, we're not going to accept the right of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution, which has been accepted for the last 250 years of American
It
history.
does seem like they're saying that they're going to do that, for example, on birthright citizenship.
Well, it remains to be seen. Look, I mean, this.
Well, they said they're going to disregard the accepted interpretation.
I mean, American legal system, the American legal system, is a very complicated place, and there's a lot of, we've already seen injunctions taken out or given against particular moves that the Trump administration wanted to make. There'll be appeals. These things will go to the Supreme Court. It's true that the Supreme Court is made up 6-3 of conservatives against liberals, but at the same time, people like John Roberts, the Supreme Court President of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, and others are also institutionalists, and they revere the tradition of American justice and jurisprudence and political life, with the checks and balances that the founding fathers of the United States put into the Constitution. So it would be a huge step for those for any president, including Donald Trump, to disregard a judgment of the Supreme Court. Now, I know that they are trying to challenge the accepted definition of what the birthright citizenship clause in the Constitution means. But all I would say is that this is a long road, and it's not clear to me where this road is going to end. And I wouldn't guarantee. And remember, Donald Trump did win the election, but 49% of the American people didn't vote for Donald Trump. So, to try to ride roughshod over such a large majority or such a large minority of the population would be a very, very risky thing to do indeed. And I hope that that the current administration doesn't go down that road.
I think
but I'm more concerned about.
Go ahead.
But I'm more concerned about their international role because
I want to ask you a question specifically on that. So,
yeah, sure.
It might be entertaining for us to discuss back and forth how far over the guardrails Donald Trump is willing to go. But the real question is, and you're the ultimate foreign affairs insider, I guess, on this, what, if anything, can we do about it in Ireland?
Well, I mean, individually, no individual country can determine how the international order will be managed. Okay, in fact, even the biggest country in the world can't do that either. So,
but we can affect how we are perceived and how we are treated, for example. And I'll give you one example. For example, all of the retrenchment on the rights of EU citizens in Britain were effectively not imposed on Irish citizens. So Irish citizens in Britain have essentially the identical rights to British citizens plus European citizenship. And I'm at a wild guess going to say that there was some lobbying going on from the Department of Foreign Affairs in the background to make sure that that happened. You can confirm or deny that or not comment as you wish. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Ireland could very cleverly suck up to Donald Trump in the right way and minimize any potential harm and perhaps even take advantage of that. In the way, for example, we know the last Trump administration, you had Middle Eastern regimes, particularly the Saudi regime, block booking empty rooms in Trump's hotel. They weren't doing that for the good of their health. They clearly thought that it would do them some advantage, that at least met the cost that they were paying for it. Therefore, we can assume they're not stupid people. That probably did work. I'm not recommending that the Department of Foreign Affairs get a department to book empty hotel rooms in New York or anywhere else. No. But is it A, possible, and B, worth it, and C, morally right for Ireland to try to manipulate that situation, given that Donald Trump is basically a narcissist and therefore highly open to manipulation?
Look, we should do whatever we can to defend and uphold our national interests vis-a-vis the United States. So we should certainly talk to them to try to prevent them from imposing any tariffs, any special tariffs on Ireland. We should explain to them that Ireland is actually a big plus for the American economy and that American companies make very large profits in Ireland, which they transfer back to the United States to the benefit of the US economy. being in Ireland gives companies access to the European market. So we can do
Giving
all
all
those
those
things.
tactics, how dirty would you be willing to fight?
Well, this first of all, we don't do that kind of thing, and for a small country to try to do that would be counterproductive in my view. So, but we can do things. We can talk to the Trump administration. We can explain various things to them and say, okay, you may think that there are all these jobs in Ireland that you want in America, but the fact is that Ireland offers you opportunities, access to a labour pool that you couldn't get anywhere in America without opening the floodgates for immigration from countries from different parts of the world. So we can explain to them why Ireland is a plus for America and not a minus. Now, we won't convince them completely, but I think we can certainly mitigate some of the potentially negative effects of American policy vis-a-vis Ireland, right? But also, we have to remember that our biggest asset is probably that we're a member of the European Union. And the European Union is no pushover when it comes to these things. So if the United States imposes tariffs on EU exports to America, there will be retaliation from the European Union. And that retaliation may well be quite effective in bringing the United States to the negotiating table to try and work out something. And I'm sure the Commission in Brussels has a number of offers up its sleeve that he can make to the United States that would not be too damaging to European interests, but that might buy off the Americans and buy trading peace for the next 4 years, which would definitely be a benefit for Ireland. But the second point, I suppose,
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
the second point, I suppose, is apart from the bilateral thing, which we just talked about, there's also the broad multilateral thing, and in that area you have to be quite alarmed by the fact that the United States has it seems to be determined to close down US aid. It's withdrawn from the climate convention. It's I think withdrawn from WHO. So it looks as if the United States is entering a period where it doesn't seem to want to become a good global citizen. It wants to do its own thing. I mean, for example, there was a summit meeting in Paris there during the week on regulating AI. And there was a conclusions of the meeting of the summit were signed by all the participants except for the United States and the United Kingdom. So, and this is another small example of where the US doesn't seem to want to be part of a global consensus, appears to want to go it alone, and that's something that's not good from an Irish point of view because we are a small country that benefits from a rules-based international system,
Yeah, yeah.
and the United States.
Pause on that, Daniel. Pause on that for a moment, because specifically
Yeah.
on that, should we ostentatiously stand up for Denmark on the issue of Greenland, or should we kind of be tactically quiet?
Well, what we should do on Denmark is we should stand up in conjunction with the European Union, rather than I mean, there's no value in Ireland rushing out, and what would we do? Send troops to Greenland to defend Greenland against the Americans? No way. So, and we have no. But I mean, our particular interest in that issue is really as a member of the European Union and a partner country with Denmark. And I have no doubt but that if the United States were to, for example, impose tariffs on Denmark, that the EU would respond as a group against those tariffs and would push back strongly. And likewise, if for some reason, whatever it might be, the United States were to impose tariffs on or to single Ireland out, which I don't believe they would do, but if they were to do that, then I think the EU would respond collectively. So my answer to your question is that we should respond as part of the European Union rather than rushing out to the front ourselves.
Yeah, but for example, to use an analogy, all European Union countries regard Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and roundly condemned their attacks on civilian targets in Israel. But there is no question that Ireland is seen as the country that is most sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians in terms of the effects of the war prosecuted by Israel. You were right, we're part of the EU, but we could be at the front of that queue or at the back of that queue. And in the way that we are perhaps at the front of the queue in regards to the Palestinians, might there be a tactical decision to be not at the front of that queue in regards to
Well,
some things that
well,
Donald
I
Trump might be interested in?
well. First of all, I have to correct you to say that I don't believe Ireland is in any way sympathetic to Hezbollah or to Hamas.
No, no,
I
not at all.
think,
No, no, no.
I mean,
But
I
that
think
hostility in many.
Ireland's
No, no.
sympathy
But
is with the
I
Palestinian
agree.
people.
I 100% agree. But that hostility, which I think is right across the EU to Hamas, I misspoke on that one, of course, is more strongly or less strongly informing the degree of sympathy and aid that is offered to Palestinians by various European countries. There is unquestionably a spectrum there, and Ireland is at one end of the spectrum
Yeah.
on that. And I'm kind of saying, and I guess you don't have an answer to it, which is entirely legitimate, but I'm just raising the idea that we could either be at
Yeah.
the most or the least critical end of the spectrum when it comes to Trump as well.
Yeah. Well, look, in the last few weeks, I've noticed that we've been pretty much in line with our European partners. For example, in defending the ICC, in our comments on the ideas that Trump put forward about Gaza. I think we've stayed in the pack, and that's the place to be. It's be part of the posse rather than, rushing to the front, making yourself a target. I do think we have to be aware of the fact that from now on, for the next 4 years, there's a different um, environment out there because Donald Trump is so much more inclined to shoot from the hip. We have to be careful that we don't give him any excuse for shooting us from the hip, because our best hope is that we can be regarded and can be viewed as part of the European Union, which he doesn't like very much either, to be quite honest with you. But the European Union collectively is in a position to stand up to a lot of what Donald Trump might try to do in the way of measures that he might take through tariffs and other things against
Okay.
the European Union. And I think we can defend ourselves in that way. I
Okay.
mean, the
Okay.
other kind of
That's a
concern,
reasonable answer.
the
I
other
want to move on.
concern, the other concern I have is the effects of Donald Trump's attitude towards Ukraine and towards NATO. Now, we're not members of NATO, so you might say, why would we care what happens in NATO? But we do care, we should care, because if NATO were to be undermined in any way, that would raise the whole question of European security in a way that would be difficult for Ireland to completely put our heads in the sand and not respond to in some way. So it would create a new situation, which I think we would be well advised to hope will not come about.
Okay, let me move on in that case, because I mentioned this concept of the good chaps in Britain, whereby they kind of sort of feel that the sort of person who should be Prime Minister knows the sort of thing, and they don't need anything like a constitution or anything to guide and to regulate the way in which the government works. And looking at your broader diplomatic experience, I'm thinking of one particular example, which was in 2009, Hillary Clinton, so newly the Secretary of State as she was, which is effectively the foreign minister for Obama newly in office in 2009, she went to Moscow and they even mocked up supposed to be some sort of a device with a button on it, which had a mistranslated, as it turned out, the word for reset. And the idea was that Sergei Lavrov, who is still the Russian foreign minister, and Hillary Clinton would together press this reset button, in other words, to dramatically improve Russian-American relations, which had essentially slowly degraded during the early years of Putin's power. I think that was an enormous misjudgment because it completely misunderstood the motivation in Moscow of why they were doing what they were doing. And it just was entirely unaware of the ideology that had developed, and it's difficult to even know whether you'd call it left-wing or right-wing, but this sort of nationalist ideology that has taken hold now much more profoundly in Russia, as we see in the propaganda around the war in Ukraine. And I guess I'm challenging your profession a little bit. Was it the case that nobody saw, like nobody in diplomatic services, nobody who should be reporting into governments on policy, nobody saw that the Russians were doing what they were doing for an entirely internally consistent set of reasons, and they were not doing things that we in the West, if you want to call us we, liked, for reasons that were totally coherent to themselves. We thought they were incoherent, and Hillary Clinton come along and say, oh, let's reset, let's, kind of draw a line under that, and then you can be a well-behaved, almost democracy. Is it the case that there was a huge, and it might not be Irish, in fact, certainly not Irish, but is it the case that there was a huge diplomatic failure in all of that there was no communication of that, entire psychological movement happening?
Well, I mean, here's my view on that. I mean, there are those who believe that the West was not sufficiently generous towards the then Soviet Union and then Russia, and that they should have been more willing to bring them into the family of nations, but that there was a kind of a residual animus towards Russia that went back to kind of Cold War days, and that there was an inability to do a proper reset. Look, I think there's always opportunity, and opportunity is usually accompanied by risk. And obviously, this reset that Hillary Clinton attempted in 2008 didn't produce the goods, in that Russia has, for the last 15, 20 years, been a kind of an aggressive power, which has really upended some of the kind of norms of international relations in the post-war period. I mean, you've got a series of these frozen conflicts, and then you have this really quite outrageous move to invade Ukraine. Because my attitude to the Ukraine war is that, of course, you can argue that maybe there were things that could have been done to prevent that war, that maybe, the West went too far in hinting that they might be willing to allow Ukraine into NATO, and didn't understand the particular historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and views in Russia that Ukraine is really part of Greater Russia. Yes, so you can always make those excuses, but I mean, I always
deal with
have
the
a
topic.
simple.
Deal with the question that did the diplomatic, not necessarily just Irish, but possibly including Ireland, did that whole diplomatic community miss that movement in Russia and completely not just misunderstand, but fail to even appreciate that it would have a huge effect?
Look, I mean, look, if I recall correctly, those days there was no consensus. I mean, there was a kind of a. I mean, Europeans would have had a very different attitude towards Russia, by the way, and I can remember quite clearly being at EU meetings, after the enlargement in 2005, and within the European Union, there were sharply different views of Russia. So all I'm saying to you is that I don't believe that the consensus that you are assuming existed actually did exist. Not in my experience, anyway.
I agree. I agree there was no consensus, but I think part of the reason why there was no consensus was people who perhaps should have been paying attention weren't. And if you look at Russian popular culture that has developed, and even things down which I think don't really get much reported in the West, but have been noted, such as pulp fiction books that are pumped out by Putin-friendly publishing houses in Russia, where the direction of the apologia is all how the World War II was a mistake. Hitler was really a good guy. The real enemy is the Americans. And if somebody had said, hang on a second, this publishing house is putting out dozens of these books every month. It is owned by someone who is clearly very close to and influenced by Putin. Should we not at least consider that this is a direction that they are pushing their national narrative, the way they see themselves? Looking at, for example, television is hugely influential in Russia, much more than in the West. If you look at popular Russian television shows, like news or discussion shows, listening to the attitudes that's on there, nobody could have taken in that information and said, well, probably the people in charge in Russia are persuadable.
Look, diplomats always have to believe that persuasion is possible, right? Because otherwise, the profession would be pointless if you had a view that it's only war rather than jaw. I mean, diplomats are addicted in a good way to trying to find solutions. I mean, look at our own situation. I remember when I first joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in the late 70s, there were people at that time who were deeply involved. I wasn't one of them, but they were deeply involved in the Northern Ireland issue and so forth. And they were going up and down, having endless meetings with people and trying to manage this terrible situation and trying to prevent it from spilling over and trying to find a kind of a way towards peace and reconciliation away from conflict. And those people, it took 20 years, 30 years almost, from the time that we first started seriously dealing with the situation in Northern Ireland. It took it took until 1998 to get an agreement. So diplomacy is it's a preference for the long game over the short game, and a belief that the long game ultimately will produce the goods. Now, we may
But
be wrong, and
don't diplomats have a duty to report back a clear-eyed,
yeah,
assessment of what is likely to work and what is
yes,
likely to happen?
uh, and they do. And I think if you were to read reports coming from Moscow over the last 30 years, you probably have had endless reports from diplomats alerting people. But ultimately, you're talking about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And Barack Obama came into office with, an extraordinary mandate, extraordinary achievement coming from nowhere to being US president, got the Nobel Prize within a year or two of being elected, for no particular reason, but
I
nonetheless,
agree. Yeah, you're right.
it was seen as the start of a new era, and he was recognized for that. And he himself obviously had fairly lofty ambitions about what he could achieve. And after the period of conservative rule under George W. Bush and so forth, and he wanted to make a mark for himself. And one of the things, I mean, he had two things. One was this reset with Russia, which obviously didn't go that well. The other was this sort of a turn towards China, which also, has had its problems. So the point is that even the American president, powerful though they cannot just, with the stroke of a pen, change the world. And that's why when you ask me, has Ireland got agency in this area? What I'm saying is that no country has agency. The only way you can move things forward is by getting the agreement of those on the ground. So, for example, a Middle East peace probably can't be imposed by Russia or by anybody else. It can only be brought about when the belligerents, when the Arab countries, the Palestinians and the Israelis, maybe helped by the Europeans and the Americans and others, can somehow decide. And that's what happened in Northern Ireland. Someone said they want an agreement. It happened in Northern Ireland. We laboured away for 20 years. And then suddenly, the two sides, for different reasons, wanted to do a deal, and the deal happened. So diplomacy is a complicated thing. It's not a black and white field. It's a field where most of the field is coloured in various shades of grey, and that's the reality of it. And I think, by the way, one of the big things that I'm looking at now is the way the BRICS have developed and have emerged as a kind
This
of a
is Brazil,
challenger.
Russia,
Brazil,
India,
Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and there
China,
are
and
other
South
countries
Africa.
as well
Yep.
that are involved. And I mean, initially probably thought that was a bit of a bit of a nonsense. What do they have in common? But I suppose what they have
What
in
you could
common
roughly
is a
call the
certain,
second world.
yeah, it's a certain resentment towards the sort of the way in which Europeans and Americans have kind of drawn the boundaries of world affairs, and established the institutions that run things around the world, insofar as they can be run. And there's sort of a sense that, hey, we have to have a little look in ourselves now. It can't no longer be an American European domination game. And I suspect that with Donald Trump now in the White House, you'll see the BRICS may be becoming more assertive and pushing back against what they may see as overreach on the part of the United States. So that's an interesting one. And I mean, of course, these countries don't have a huge amount in common in many ways, but the thing that does unite them is a resentment about the way in which Europeans and Americans have kind of ruled the roost. And, the fact that there are two European countries on the Security Council of the UN, and India is not there, and Brazil is not there. These are the kind of resentments that fuel, the BRICS. And I could see the BRICS getting closer together, maybe
Really?
gathering more
Is that true?
support.
Does the average person in South Africa get really annoyed
No,
that both France
no,
and
but
Britain have seats on the UN Security Council, or do they even
well,
know? Or
I think in India they do, right? I mean, in India, India's a different story. India's a country with 1.5 billion people now, and no seats on the Security Council. And you saw at this AI summit during the week, you had Modi was almost the kind of co-chair of the whole exercise, and he was really trying to present himself, and he signed this declaration, whereas the Americans didn't. So I do think that one of the reasons why I believe that we are at a hinge moment, which is to come back to the first topic we dealt with, is because you have genuine change in the world, that you have two countries now with 1.5 billion people or thereabouts that have strongest economies growing rapidly.
This
Well,
is India
not
and
not
China you're
in China.
referring to.
China they're having problems at the moment, but that will sort of be overcome eventually. But you have two countries that are now economically powerful and also have got a lot of political muscle
Yeah,
to
let
use.
me relate that to Ireland. Let me relate that to Ireland because
Yeah,
I'll tell you something that I saw, and this was in Malta of all places, and it occurred twice. Once was in an ATM machine. I'm not sure where the second one was. It might have been a menu or a sign outside a restaurant. But they had, as tourist places generally do, various notices in all of the tourist languages, and they had a Russian flag and Russian text, and they had an Italian flag and Italian text, and they had a French flag and French text, and German flag and German text. And beside the English text, in two cases, there was a tricolour. And
really.
of all the places for that to happen, Malta easily is the EU country with the strongest allegiance to Britain. Malta as an island was awarded the George's Cross, the entire island, for bravery in World War II, resisting the Nazis. It was the only basically place in the Mediterranean that the Nazis didn't control. If you go to Malta, it's not two pin plugs that you get on the continent. They use the same plugs as us and the British. Clearly they speak English. They have a common travel arrangement with Britain like we do, so that's the only other EU passport that you can walk into Britain and work in Britain without a visa these days. But even they were, it seemed like a very small thing. But so number one, is it reasonable to say that Britain has lost an awful lot of soft power because of Brexit? And number two, is that either good or bad or a mixture of both for us?
Well, look, Britain has lost a lot because of Brexit, but I've never believed that Brexit was a disaster for Britain. I think it was an own goal, but you can score an own goal and still win the game. So I don't think Britain's economy or Britain's soft power is going to collapse because of Brexit. But I think most British people now probably regret what was done. They regret
it's 2-1 in the latest polls.
Having been sucked in by some pretty disingenuous people who made claims that simply couldn't be sustained. So, but I don't take this kind of narrative of British decline very seriously. And by the way, British decline doesn't suit Ireland, right? Because we have a very close relationship with Britain. We always will have. Common travel area is one reason. The fact that for the smaller SMEs, Irish-owned companies, Britain's by far the biggest market they have. There's all sorts of reasons why if Britain does well, we do well too. The best situation, the best environment for Ireland is when the European Union economy is doing well, the US economy is doing well, and the British economy is doing well. If any one of those three goes downhill, then Ireland, as an open trade-dependent economy, suffers big time. And therefore, I've never been one of those people who says, "Oh, the Britain should be forced to face the consequences of its decision on Brexit, and it should be made to pay." Because if Britain were to pay in the way of economic pain because of Brexit, we would be paying part of that cost in Ireland. So I think we have to be sensible about these things, and we may have an atavistic desire to see Britain come a cropper. We may have a sort of a certain
England's
disdain for
difficulty.
those. Well, no, we may have a certain disdain for those good chaps that you referred to earlier on. But at the end of a long day, we're neighbours. As an old colleague of mine used to say, you can come to terms with your geography, or say, you can come to terms with your history, but you can't do much about your geography. So we are forever and a day going to be the nearest neighbours of the United Kingdom, and we better have a good relationship with them, and we better hope that they do well, because if they do well, that will reflect positively on Ireland and be to our benefit.
Daniel, to finish up, can we get a recommendation of a poem for our contemporary time?
Well,
I should say I sprung this question on you without warning.
well, no. It's okay. No, I am I'm the president of the Yeats Society in Sligo, the honorary president. So I always, and I've written a book on W.B. Yeats, Pilgrim's Soul, W.B. Yeats in the Ireland of his time, and I really do revere Yeats's work. And actually, I think that although I've also written a book on James Joyce, Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey, I think that today's Ireland could do well to not allow its enthusiasm for Joyce's gritty forensic modernism to overshadow the fact that W.B. Yeats is a poet that his concern for Ireland in various ways was of epic proportions, unlike Joyce, who was fascinated by the Ireland he left behind in 1904, but didn't really pay much attention to what happened in Ireland after that. So I would still look at the second coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, and everywhere the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And to go to the end of that poem where he talks about a rough beast coming out of the desert, slouching towards Bethlehem to be born, we have to hope that whatever rough beast is out there will eventually go back into its stable and won't actually overturn the world order, which has benefited Ireland so richly over the last 30 years as we've prospered immensely from the globalization of the post-Cold War world. And a final note is that I think the big thing with Ireland is that we managed to combine tradition and a contemporary edge. And I hope that we can continue to be, as Yeats called it, the indomitable Irishry, indomitably Irish, that we will continue to preserve our Irish heritage, even though we now have to operate in a changed world. And a final point is that, apart from the other things you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I'm also a director of a children's entertainment brand called the Carlicons. And we are trying to create the next big thing in children's television, follow up to Peppa Pig and Paw Patrol and those, based on an updating of the leprechaun legend. So the idea is very much in line with my own view that we need to be both traditional and also contemporary. And that's why I've become a director and a brand ambassador for the Carlicons. Check them out on www.carlicons.com. Thank you.
Daniel Mulhall, author, ambassador, diplomat, free man of London and Waterford. Thank you very much for talking to me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Daniel Mulhall at Dan Mulhall. Get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially to EF. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.